Okay, welcome to FileMaker PUG Dallas Chapter User Group Meeting. This is March 5th, 2021. I'm Taylor Sharp, and I'm one of the chapter co-coordinators along with Greg Price, who's here. And we're happy to have everybody here as we have another of our monthly virtual meetings. Hoping someday to start having some in-person ones, but I think we're going to be virtual for a number of months still to go. So anyway, Greg, do you have any announcements? Only announcement I can think of is FileMaker, or excuse me, Claris has moved to a new location. They're now in Sunnyvale. So
in a thoroughly nondescript building
oh
in the
yes,
middle of an industrial park.
that doesn't look unique. It's not like the Wedge where there was something special about it.
Nope.
So anyway, but that's the only announcement I can think. I guess the other announcement is we don't have any presenters for the next few months, so we need to start drumming up some presenters. So get with Greg or I if you've got some suggestions or you guys would want one, but keep that in mind. And I guess we're going to kick things off. We appreciate Robert being here to give a presentation. And it's going to be a presentation about good coding practices, which I think all of us can always do better at. Even those of us who work hard at it, you can always improve there. So anyway, without further ado, Robert, I'm turning it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Taylor. So I think I'll be stopping my video and starting the screen sharing on my end. So you get to see the slides that I have prepared for today. And we'll be up in just a second. Here we go. So feel free to tell me if everyone can see my screen. So I'm not hearing anyone.
Yes.
Yes. Oh, okay. Perfect. Perfect. Because I was collapsing the camera feed at the same time. So wonderful. So yes, today I have something here that is about making our code more readable, and I think, like you said, Taylor, it's something we should be keeping in mind at all times. It's not the kind of stuff we can just be like, yeah, we've looked into it a couple of years back, you know, and now it doesn't matter so much. It's kind of always relevant. It may not be as fancy as things that are more trendy and that we're hearing a lot about recently, stuff like JavaScript, CentOS, and other things. So this is more like in the back to basics category, but it's good to keep a close eye on that kind of stuff. So as we all know, no one is against virtue, but I think knowing why things like this matter can motivate us into making sure that we deploy some more efforts into it than what we would be inclined to do just naturally. So let's dive in. About myself quickly. Well, Robert, I do sing choir, although today I don't think I'll be singing because choir says it's more than one. And I like to quote with FileMaker, and also I'm saying out there, I am lazy, and I hope that you also get to be lazy, not in a bad way, but in a good way. I think there's good laziness, and we can tailor or work in a way where we don't have to work as hard for things that are part of our day-to-day routines. So here's the main objective for today. I think comments are one of the biggest threats to making our code more readable. They're too easy to just rely on. It can almost be perceived as the only tool we have to make our code more readable. So I'm not completely against comments, but I think there are reflexes that we have that are worth just fighting a bit. So on today, we're going to be talking about why we should care about all this. We're going to look into naming, and then we're going to explore some of the strategies that we can implement that can help us have code that is more readable. Of course, we have to talk about comments because they are part of the equation. So It's also part of the topics we're going to discuss. We're going to look into some gadgets that we can deploy that also will lend their hand at what might get involved here. And then just parting notes and an open discussion as time allows for this. So before I go any further, I have to say, this is a discussion format, really. I mean, I'm going to be going through slides, but if at any point in time you feel like you want to share something or you want to ask questions, by all means, go ahead. It's much more enjoyable this way. Also, it's a subjective topic, so I don't want to be offending anyone. I don't want like there are things where it's not like there's a clear line that says this is good, this is bad. Even if at some point it's going to say so on screen, just take it with a grain of salt. You know, some of what I'm showing is based on my own practice, and it is changing. So it can be derived from content that was shared in the community. Not always easy to give proper attribution. So I hope you're going to be forgiving me if someone is not getting proper credit for things they've been putting out there. So I said already, there's no set it and forget it. We should keep working at this pretty much every single day. There are concepts that are very, very good and long lasting. And if you've seen Jerry Robbins' 2014 DevCon presentation, maybe some of the concepts in there you'll see repeated in here. And last thing is, I hope you like quotes. And speaking of quotes, we have our very first one here. So all relationships really are based on trust. Okay, customers, employees, partners, where you eat, what you eat. It applies to code also. How can we trust something that we don't understand? How are we going to understand it? Reading it is not making that easy. So let's look at why we should care. Okay, and it can be more costly than we think. So here we have yet another quote that pretty much says, our job is not just to make stuff work, you know, it's to make stuff make sense, that people would understand it. You know, the computer, it's a syntax, and it's built the way that you can't really write something that the computer won't understand. It may not behave the way you expected, but it's always going to understand what you tell it, you know. So good code is not about, is the computer going to understand it or not? Good code is about, is someone else able to read it and understand it? And this one is really really telling everything. You know, one man's crappy software is another man's full-time job. I think even if we're in a time where people may be concerned about job security and all those things, no one wants that type of job security. Having to maintain something that's just a mess is not what people are thinking of as their dream job type of thing. So why we should care? Or obviously we should care for others, okay? Because our code is alive. It's not this rock that just stands there and is not going to change for 100 years. People will interact with it. They're going to be curious about it. They may want to change some of it. And in order for them to do that, well, they need to understand it. And if we're not making their job easy, then it's on us. You know, they're going to say, well, I don't quite like that. And maybe I'm going to try to figure out who's the author and see that I use less and less of his stuff, you know. But also not just for others, for ourselves. Things change over time, and we're called to go back into our code and say, okay, well, what was this doing again? You know, sometimes it's just about, okay, what are the business rules? Sometimes it can be something else altogether. But I'm sure we've all been into that situation where we're looking at our code and we're like, what was I thinking? Or wait a second, am I the one who wrote this? So it's not always as easy as we would hope, and hopefully after today we will have picked up on some tips that can make that a bit better. So what happens then if code is not code that can be trusted or understood? Well, there's a couple things that come into play. The first one being maintenance and updates. Okay, because if you speak to a colleague and he looks at your code and he's like, yeah, I'd rather not touch it. You know, that's not the sign that tells you that code is going to be staying alive. You know, it's more likely to just sit on a shelf and gather some dust until someone eventually pulls the plug on it. So something else, like a question, is it working? I don't know, maybe. Doesn't sound too reassuring. Actually, I don't think there's a single intonation where you can answer that question that's going to make it more comforting for the person asking the question. It's just not the answer we want when we're asking this, you know, or how is it working, you know. So let's make sure that again we can make it easy to answer that, because it's a legitimate question. Lastly, there's the IKEA effect or the start over. So basically, this comes into play when we have code that can be working just fine, okay, or actually it can be working perfectly, but it still can fall victim to not being understood or trusted. And then what happens is we're telling ourselves, well, you know what, I can code this, okay, so I'll put in my new piece of code and I'll be completely familiar with it, you know, so problem solved. You know, it's just we too easily we forget that it's not just coding it, it's also testing and debugging and a number of things that make it more time requiring than what we would be hoping for. And also here I'm saying notice the nuance between working perfectly and good code, because I didn't say it's good code. I said it's code that can be working perfectly, because good code is code that can be trusted. So another good way for code to be losing trust is if you spot in there some comments that are inconsistent with what the code does. Comments can be a lot of maintenance. I don't know about you, but I already said that I'm lazy. So if I can skip on that maintenance, I'll be happy to do so. Not in a way that I don't want to have the comments, but if I can not have the comment in the first place, then I'm sure that I'm not going to have to maintain it and update it as the code evolves. So funny thing about the IKEA effect, it's not a funny word just like that. It's an actual thing. If you look it up, it has its own Wikipedia page, you know, and it's the phenomenon that happens when we end up placing more value in something because we created it or partially created it. We contributed to it. In the case of IKEA, it's clear that we're talking about furniture that people are putting together, assembling, and then putting in their homes. But it applies to other things as well, and code is one of those things that it can apply to. There are other effects that come into play also. One is the mere exposure effect, and this is what happens when we develop a preference for things just because we're more familiar with them, and it's completely understandable. I mean, if I get to choose in between something that I know next to nothing about and something that I'm more familiar about, it's not about is it working better or not. It's just about, well, you know, this one feels safer because I'm familiar with it, and that's it. So it can trump a bunch of other things, and we have to be mindful that this is coming into play. And one last effect that is coming to play is, and when we start rewriting things, is the Dunning-Kruger effect, and that one says that when we have a somewhat low ability at a task, we tend to overestimate our own ability at achieving it. So if we're not an expert familiar with that specific topic, we're likely to think it's easier than it really is. And I can say that clearly applied to me when I thought I could put together the material for this this presentation. So a couple things to look into, and I was taken aback when I learned about those things. One is we have Robert C. Martin, who says when we look at the time we spend writing code and the time we spend reading code, he says for every hour we write code, we end up reading for like 10 times more. We spend time reading code. So 1 hour of writing code equates to 10 hours of reading code. And if we push that further, that means that for when we write code for 10 hours, we end up reading code for 100 hours. That's a chunk of time. I mean, even if he's off by, let's say, half of that, if it's 1 to 5, it still is a crazy amount of time. So if we can make sure that we spend less time reading, and that the time we spend reading is more enjoyable, I think we all benefit from that. What we have on the right-hand side of that slide is just a reflection about programming language versus like spoken languages. If we think of how we learn those languages, if I take a class for, say, German, Italian, Spanish, I don't know, people are going to show me, okay, well, here's the syntax and so on and so on. And then at some point, they're going to say, okay, now go read a book, go listen to a movie, go watch a play or something like that. You know, they're not going to say, okay, go write a novel. It's not what they're going to say. But somehow for programming, we take things and we kind of flip them upside down. We say, here's the syntax. You go now. Okay, you've got the building blocks. Just go on and start writing some code. You know, it starts with "Hello World." So we're never hearing about people saying, okay, go look at this code and try to take it apart and understand how it's written and so on. Maybe we should do more of that. So this is just a funny quote saying, if you think your code doesn't need to be readable because no one else is looking at it, well, make sure you're not confusing cause and effect, you know, something to think about maybe. So let's look into naming and why obsessing about that is a good thing. I don't want any of us to be worried. I'm not going to be forcing a naming convention on you. It's not what it's about. Even if having a convention is a good thing. So make sure you have one. Just yeah. So Phil Carlton says 2 hard things in computer science: cache invalidation and naming things. I know nothing about cache invalidation, and I'm sure it's a nightmare. But naming things, we have to do pretty often, and I have to admit, it looks simple, but it's actually hard. Naming is our most powerful tool. Naming is what we can use to be understood. We are designers, and naming shows our intent. It tells a story. So let's put some thought behind it. And so what should we be doing when we're naming things? Well, first is let's be good parents. You know, FileMaker is letting us rename stuff easily. You know, it has its own internal ID, and then it renames elsewhere for us where it's called. Let it be scripts, or let it be fields or tables or table occurrences and so on. But let's not rely on that feature too much. You know, I think one is if we say, yeah, I'll get to rename it later, so I can choose a name right now that doesn't even matter. Later, maybe much later than you think. It can actually be never, you know. So let's stop and take the time and do that now. And also, it's just a bad habit, you know. If we look at it, we don't do that for the rest of stuff, you know. If we have our own kid and we say, hey Fred, happy birthday. Great that you're turning 5-year-old. From now on, we're going to call you Sebastian, because Sebastian is just so much better than Fred. You know, no one would do that. So let's not do it. But again, renaming can break stuff. You know, it used to be that there were fewer moving parts, but now we have a bunch of stuff Let it be server schedules, FMP URLs, API calls. Um, it's not true anymore that we can just rename things and expect everything to follow everywhere else. So that means the name we start with, either we stick with it or we have more maintenance to do after the fact. So let's choose the right name from day one, so we skip on the maintenance later. Good news is we name stuff all the time. Okay, there's I was going to say countless. I sure we could count them, but I'm not going to go there. There's plenty of stuff we get to name: custom functions, tables, and variables, layout objects. You pun intended. You name it, there's a name to be applied to it. So let's just be mindful about how we name things, and we're bound to improve from there on. But it needs to be a conscious exercise. We can't just throw it there for the sake of naming for naming. So knowing what a name is, well, we also need to look into what a name is not. And I would suggest a name is not an abbreviation. And I know sometimes we're dealing with drop downs that are very narrow and it's not easy. So you can take this with a grain of salt, but the bottom line still is there. Okay, if you take even the full expression and you ask some of your friends, how would you abbreviate this? Chances are they're each going to come up with a different abbreviation than the one you were thinking of yourself. Now flip that game around and start with the abbreviation and say, hey, what does this stand for? Well, you're just going to get even more diverse answers than what you were getting in the original game. So if we think we're saving space, well, yes, abbreviation will save you space, but they're not going to save you time. It's not about keystrokes that you type on the keyboard. So and for the confusion that abbreviations can bring in, I would say they're not going to save you time in any form or fashion. So a name is also not a shorthand or an acronym. Okay, there is this one system I came across, and the developer before me took it on himself to use a custom function, and that custom function was GSP, and then I was like, okay, what's this? And I got into the custom function dialog, and sure thing, it was just get script parameter, so that person just didn't want to spend the time to write it, but then he had a whole set of functions like that, and when I looked at the code, it would just obfuscate what I would expect to be there. I couldn't really understand. Every time I need to either second guess or go actually look for, oh, how is he gonna build an acronym for something that I know, So there's a ton of utilities that you can use that will expand as you type when watching for some sequence of keystrokes. So go get that, and don't do what I just described, because someone will curse your name, I can guarantee you. A name is also not part of an arbitrary series. Okay, so if you come across stuff that looks like this, I was saying earlier that I am lazy, but this is not good laziness. This is bad laziness at its worst. Okay, so XYZ new, XYZ new 2, old, and all that stuff, or 1, 2, 3. It just says, okay, someone just didn't want to spend the time to name it the right way. So let's not do that. A name should be pronounceable. It should be easy to search for using your preferred DDR tool. And yeah, I think that's all I'll say about naming. So let's look at some examples. Here I have some bad stuff on the left, and I'll say mostly variables. Okay, so $PC, $prodcat, I'm not going to try to pronounce that. $D with a comment that says elapsed time in days, GSP that I talked about earlier, and a slightly longer calculation or expression. So what would be better in terms of readability? Well, if say $PC stands for product category, would have anyone guessed that? I doubt it. You need a lot of context, to say, okay, we're talking about product category. So, and the difference in between the count of characters or keystrokes is not that much, So let's just spell it in and make sure that it's clear. And now that I've said that PC stands for product category, I'm sure that you know that ProdCat also stands for, oh, not quite, product catalog. Yeah, because obviously it's not like once you have something abbreviated, there could be other full words that it's going to expand into. It's not like there's a single thing. So nothing can be taken for granted. And so spelling it out is really the only way you know that the person has read what you thought they should be reading. So if we take that one step further and looking at the variable I didn't want to pronounce, who would have guessed that it stood for filtered student names? Next to no one would be my guess, For the next one, when we have $D, well, someone could say, yeah, well, it's using a comment. That's more readable, right? I would say to some extent, yes. Okay, better than just $D with nothing next to it. But at the same time, I would push with some questions saying, well, are we going to add the comment everywhere we use $D? Because if not, we're making the reader hunt for that information, And if so, then why just not name the variable that way? You'll save yourself from having to type it everywhere aside from the variable name, and you're typing it already. Actually, you're typing more characters if you think of the spaces. So, so yeah, let's just spell it out. It's the easiest thing. So GSP we've discussed already. And now the last one is not really about naming per se, because it's all native functions. You don't get to choose how that stuff is called. But a good way to use custom functions, as not the GSP way, would be to have something like this, which is more readable. I mean, it's not like the calculation on the left is impossible to decipher. You know what it is when you're looking at it, but it's just more easy on your eye when you look at the custom function, the way it's named, you just know what it's going to throw out, and from there, it's a done deal, So so yeah, let's just keep those things in mind when we are coding. Here are some recommendations. So for Booleans, we shouldn't have things that will start with is or has, like is paid if we're talking about an invoice or something like that. For arrays or lists, using plurals to make a distinction, then we're not just dealing with one item, but we're dealing with a bunch of them. Functions and scripts should use a verb and a target. And for everything, it's all about consistency, consistency, consistency. Let's not switch between styles within a single system. If we have fetch and retrieve, let's stick to it. Let's not switch over to get and set or read and write, update, create, and so on and so on. If we use something as prefix, let's let them be prefix all the way, not switching in between prefix and suffix or uppercase and lowercase. Those things need to have a meaning. The user or the reader needs to be able to look at that and see that it makes sense. So be specific, be explicit. No one wants to be guessing what we were thinking. So this is a very good quote, and I like it because it applies to so much. Think that you can't do it right. Well, make sure that you make some space on your calendar, because you're going to have to work on it again. And it applies to naming as well. Okay. Let's be lazy and not have to do stuff twice. Let's do it right the first time. Bad names are like raindrops. A single one is not going to ruin your day, but you never receive a single raindrop. The first one you see tells you there's more to come. So something personal I want to share here. When FileMaker introduced JSON with FileMaker 16, I was so thrilled about it. I started using it, and I started using it in how I would name my script variables. And that was fine. And you may like it, you may not like it. That's up to you. But if you do like it, what I would say is make sure not to extend that into fields. Field names, because the data API is returning JSON, and it uses the actual field names as keys of the JSON, and keys with periods in them. It's just a recipe for disaster right now. So so yeah, let's just keep that in mind. So let's look at a couple more tools that we can use to make sure that our code is more readable, because as we all know, if all we have is a hammer, everything will look like a nail. And the hammer here is comments, you know. So this is something fun. Maybe you've seen it on a T-shirt printed or somewhere on a website. I do think it is fun. Now, how do we go about making sure that our code does not need explanation? Well, we have a couple tricks here. The first one is avoiding magic numbers. So, what are magic numbers? Let's look at an example. Okay, so if I have a loop here, okay, basic stuff, and I say, okay, we're going to exit the loop if our counter is greater than 52, and then we're going to do some stuff and increment the counter. Well, 52 what? Okay. If we take the same example, but then I say, let's set a variable to week count 52, and then I have the same segment of code. Okay. Well, it's clear that now we're looping on weeks, you know. And if I change the example and now I set the variable to a deck size, then it's clear that as we're looping on cards. So magic numbers are that. They're numbers that are coming out of nowhere, coming out of a magician hat, you know, that have no context, no explanation, and that you cannot figure out why it's there. So if you, again, spell things out, it makes it that much easier to understand the context. And not everything is a magic number. If you're taking a number and rounding it to 2 decimals, you don't need to say round 2 is the number of decimals I want. If you're talking about hours in a day, seconds in a minute, that stuff is pretty self-explanatory. Zeros and ones and all that stuff. But for most everything else, I'd say let's consider how you would use the numbers, and if putting them in a variable would help readability. One example that made that very, very clear to me was something I looked up online, and they said, well, here's two sample functions, you know, and they're both using the number 151, okay? And the first function is called, have I caught them all? And the second function is called, how many more do I have to catch? And the reveal was simply that 151 was called, put into a variable, and that variable was called total Pokemon, you know? And only at that time could I understand the context of the function. If I'm just looking at a function and look at 151, I'm like, oh, what's the purpose? So also, let's go easy on negations. I don't know if sometime you've been into layout mode and you've tried to hide a layout object using the hide condition, and then you came back to browse mode and you were like, how come it's not behaving the way I want, you know? And then you're like, oh, it shouldn't be hide when, it should be show when. Well, basically, it's all boiling down to our brain is not specifically wired to process information in the negative format, you know. So anytime it has to do so, it's spending more cycles to resolve whatever it has in front of it, and it may not always resolve the way it should, you know. So it's not easy to switch between the two. It can be misleading us for both the intent and the result. So let's make sure that if we do use negation, that we use it only when it's intuitive to do so. Next, we have indentation. And this one is pretty easy. Okay, so if we have a basic calculation, I'm going to go with something here that is a straight concatenation of first name and last name. If one of them is empty, we can put them together with nothing in between. If we have something in both of them, then we put in a comma and a space. So that's basic stuff. Okay, but if we just take this and put it like this, then we see like the first condition and then the result, and then a comment that says whatever is below is the default result. And here the comment is not so much to tell us that it's the default, but it's much more so that when we look at it with our eye, the pattern of things being listed in pairs is preserved. Okay, so indentation is the only thing here that lets us get that. So let's make sure that we use it. Again, there are a great number of keyboard utilities that can put in indentation for us when we type statements that we use pretty often. Case is one of them where I use that. So let's make sure that it's there. Okay. That said, when we're talking about indentation, let's not go overkill on it. You know, at some point it can be hampering how we are reading things. So let's not overdo it. Same goes for white space. Okay, so what we have here on the left is really not that hard to read, and it's actually oversimplified. Okay, so adding white space in between each of the pairs to the right is helping in this case just slightly or just a little bit, but that what we have here can be more of a problem if we have some items in the actual calculation where lines would be wrapping, or maybe we have something that needs to be evaluated, and within the line we have semicolons that then can make it a bit harder for our eye to parse out things. So just adding the white space can make it easier on our eye and our brain. So white space in script, well, basically I can't recall when it was introduced, but it's been in the product like feels forever to me. There's no reason not to use it. It gives us a chance to divide things into subsections, and for each of them we can then title them. And we saw that naming stuff is a good thing, you know, because it carries meaning, it tells our intent, and so on. So same applies for subsections within a script. Custom functions. Well, custom functions, the name is pretty clear that it's custom, and that's the good thing about it. They're dry, and I love that if I need to update something, it updates everywhere for me. So but the main thing is really you get to choose the name, and maybe you are using functions from someone else that you lift up from the web somewhere on a website, and that's totally fine. I'm just saying, don't hesitate to rename it, the function itself. You know, there's no one who's going to come banging on your door saying, hey, what are you doing there? The original author intended for this function to be named this way. No, there's no such thing. So just be mindful that if we're talking about a function that is widely used elsewhere in the community, and you grab someone else's code and you think that just by copy pasting it into your file it's going to work, well, if you rename the function, then you're going to have to handle that part. But if it's something where you're mostly dealing with it yourself, then just make sure that the name is making sense with the rest of the functions that you have in your solution. That is not just some miscellaneous naming. Let statements. So if we again take a quick look at a very simple calculation here, we're talking about an invoice line item, trying to figure out what's the cost that we're going to put on there, and we have something very basic here. Okay, quantity times the cost with a discount rounded to 2 decimals. So it's nothing fancy, okay? But if we just throw in a let statement and we have something that clearly tells us every step of the way what we're doing, or if we want, we can start from the innermost element, in this case, the extended cost. And so we know right away what it's outputting, and then we can step back step by step and saying, okay, well, what is the extended cost made of? And we see that it involves the discounted rate and the full cost. So sometimes a calculation may be clear enough. Okay, you don't have to use a let statement. In this case, if we were to say, well, as things may evolve, you know, if we have to figure out what's the largest discount out of a product discount, customer discount, a coupon, and a general sale, then I'd say, yeah, going with the let statement is going to make that much more easy than trying to jam everything into the calculation we have above. So 102, by the way, in this case, are not magic numbers, you know. And also, we need to pay a bit of attention when we talk about let statements, because depending on how the let statement is framed, it could outperform a calculation, but it could also underperform a calculation. So if performance is really your prime concern, just keep that in mind. One item here we have is let's avoid null values into our calls. And I'd say that stands mostly for things that are position-based, okay? So what is position-based in our code? Oftentimes it's gonna be plugin calls, and sometimes it can also be script parameter passing. So if we look at something like a send mail, here we have, if I take this and I say, hey, James, could you add a BCC to that call, please? Well, you have to go look at the actual documentation to figure out which of, like, what position the BCC stands in that call. You know, there's no way someone can randomly figure out what's the one where to put the BCC. You know, you could put in a BCC in different places and then run a send mail to actually see where it goes and so on. But usually you want to avoid going that far. Something much easier would be to do something like this, you know? So from there, if someone says, hey, please add a BCC, well, they don't even need to change the actual call. You know, they just need to make sure that before the function is called, that they load the content that is required into that variable. So that is much easier. And if we look at a script where we say we want to add a phone to a contact, where here it's somewhat clear, we say, okay, we have a selected ID and then a second item, and then we're talking about a cell, and it looks like we're sending in the phone number as well. But again, if I ask my friend James, hey, what's that script second parameter again? Well, he has to go in the script to know, you know, it's not going to tell him. So same thing here. If we just spell things out, we're going to know right away that, okay, that script is expecting a contact ID and then a flag that tells us if the phone is to be used as the default phone contact, and then the type, and then the phone number. And from looking at cell and the actual number, it's easy to know what the data is, but sometimes the data itself is not really going to be revealing as to the role it plays in the script that you're calling. So naming it in a variable could be more revealing than the actual data. One thing I'll say here about performing find is let's avoid the restore option. I know that some people like to use that. I happen not to like it. And why is it the case? Well, I think it's just hiding stuff from whoever is reading the script. You know, you have to click and go into a dialogue so it breaks the flow of what you're reading. And if something happens where the problem I'm looking for is nested in that dialogue, well, I better not know where you live, you know. Let's use steps that we can read. We can just as well say, okay, enter find mode, set field, new record if you need to, or whatever, and then perform find, and it's going to behave just the same. So what's in the dialogue is not simple enough for me to just guess what it's doing. I need to go and read it. So let's spell things out. I guess it's the key takeaway from this whole presentation. Script parameters. Well, again, here, let's make sure that when we are looking at the header part of our script, that whatever the script is expecting, we are making a clear mention of it. You know, if we have something that is raising a variable from a script parameter at row 57 of our script, the thing we can be sure is that someone will call the script without sending in the required parameter, and then how it's going to behave is just going to be dependent on how good our error handling is. So let's make everyone's life easier and see that we make a mention of the required parameters as early as possible in the script. Some people even go so far as to make that part of the script name itself. In that case, it makes it even more like something that looks like a function, and technically it is a function because it takes an input and does something and then provides an output. I tend to shy away from that because there's a limitation on the length of the script names. But if you want to use that, by all means, please do. So this is the quote I was hinting to in my slide about perform find with restore. So it's a funny quote, but I didn't include it into this presentation for the fact that it's a funny quote. I included it in this presentation for some little known things about the quote itself. And little known is the fact that the original quote says code for readability. And it also dates back to 1991, not 2012, not 2005, and so on and so on. 1991, you know, and I'm ready to bet that code readability was a concern even before then, and that it still is going to be for the foreseeable future. It's not like it's going to go away. So Joel Spolsky here says it's harder to read code than to write it, and this ties directly into one of the first quotes that we looked into, saying any fool can write code that a computer can understand, but good programmers write code that humans can understand. So it says the same thing in a shorter fashion, and I think it says that Joel Spolsky is very knowledgeable about coding. If I'm right, I think he is the founder of Trello and also one of the co-founder of Stack Overflow, if I'm right. So general rules and recap. Let's explain our magic tricks. Secrets are not welcome. There are no bonus points for speaking, for being sneaky or clever or fitting all our code in a single line. Saving keystrokes is not going to save us time. It will actually cost us more time. Good naming is more than half the battle. Okay, we have to avoid magic numbers and use white space and indentation without nesting too much. Custom functions and less statements are our friends. Let's avoid values in our calls and never make the reader guess. So let's spell everything out for our find requests and variable initialization, making sure that it's easier for the reader to figure out everything he needs to know. By the end of all this, we should have our own writing style, and our own doesn't mean unique. It means that we're fully familiar with it, and that when comes the time for us to name something else or write a segment of code, it's just going to flow. And the same way, if a reader looks at our code at some point, what comes next in the code will be predictable because of the trends and patterns that it follows. The way things are will become what the reader expects. And that is when we can say mission accomplished. let's look into comments. So here we have Ron, who says, code never lies, comments sometimes do. Code can only do what we tell it to do. Comments are not for the computer, they're for us. They drive nothing about our code. Every time we write a comment, if the comment is about what the code does, if the code is updated, then our comment is at risk of being outdated. I'll say that again. If the code is updated, our comment is at risk of being outdated. Comments that tell us what the code does are heavy maintenance. And being lazy as I am, I try to see that as little as maintenance as I need to do is what I'll do, not more than I have to do, please. So let's look at what we're given in FileMaker for comments. We have field comments, script comments that can be multi-line if you're working on a Mac. If you're working on a PC, I think multi-line is not supported. I think it truncates the comment. We have within calculation end-of-line comments or block comments, and we also have notes that we can put on our relationship graph. So good comments will tell us why, not necessarily what the code is doing or how it's doing it. You know, just reading the code should tell us those things. It can give us the intent, and we'll skip the obvious because that's going to be spelled out, you know, in our code. And for variables, for instance, you can use comments to tell us what's possible for say valid entries, if it's a list or if it's a range, or you can make a mention of the unit of measure. But even for unit of measure, I would argue someone could put that straight into the variable name. So comments can be informative. They can be warnings. Okay, for instance, if you have a comment that says, oh, this perform script on server will run for about 5 minutes, and that's normal, you know. There's no way for me to look at the code and kind of know or guess how long the script will run server side. So that comment tells me something that is relevant, you know. And lastly, comments can also be to-dos, temporary by nature. Just make sure that if you use comments as to-dos, that someone does come back later and implement those to-dos and does the cleanup work of taking the comments away. So code can't explain why the program is being written and the rationale for choosing a method over another. It cannot discuss the reasons certain alternative approach were taken. So those are things where we can use comments and to a greater extent documentation to make sure that people know what were our thought process like. And here we have Bertrand Meyer, who says, incorrect documentation is often worse than no documentation. And that is not only because being misled is a complete waste of time, but more importantly, it erodes the trust relationship we have with the code. And everything is about trust. Nothing else matters. So a couple gadgets that can help us on the way. If it's good for Batman, it must be good for me too. I would say let's make sure that we have those things in our backpack. One of them is MBS for Monkey Bread software. It's a plugin. The plugin is available on both Mac and PC, but the features that I'm talking about here are only available on the Mac version. And the plugin is a paid plugin, but again, those features are available in the free version of the plugin. So we're talking about it can check for variable declarations and warn you if something is used but without being declared earlier in the script. It has custom syntax colorization and will highlight pairs of script steps for you, like if and end if, loop and end loops, find and replace an account. So a good number of things and a couple more than what is actually listed here. I just ran short on the space on my slide here. So one more thing would be a text expanding utility. So a text expander, typinator, I think in the case of ATEX, we're talking about something that's literally $5. So there's no reason not to be using one. If you are coding on both Mac and PC, just make sure to look for something that is cross-platform, because I don't think you're going to want to redefine all of your um, keyboard macros in two different systems. And one thing I'm adding in here is a snippets folder. So something like Clip Manager, FM Clips, Dropship FM. I think there's also one more clip from the team at One More Thing. So those can be great for you to just reuse code that you use a lot of the time and make sure they're handily available. One bonus item would be MonoDraw on Mac. Okay, it is a bit like Visio meeting with ASCII art. Okay, so I'm gonna show that at the end of the presentation, and I would say, yeah, so it lets you use ASCII characters to draw shapes. If you're on PC, you can try that URL below, textstick.com. It has some similar features. Parting notes. So here we have someone who says there's only two kind of programming languages. Those people always bitch about, and those nobody uses. And that is just to say, if we think the problem is coming from FileMaker, let's think again. Our code won't be more readable if we write it in another language. This is not what it's about. Usually, it's pretty much all behind the keyboard. So let's look at how we do things. And when we are having some time to read things, well, if you come across, just Google for how to write unmaintainable code, you're going to come across this link here. And not only is it completely hilarious, but at the same time, if you take every statement that's in there and you flip it around, then you've got an actually great guide about how you can implement things that will make your code both more readable and maintainable. So that's it. I guess all I have to say now is let's go out and write code that others will trust. So one thing I wanted to show with MonoDraw. So here's an example, okay? And we see that it's using ASCII characters, but when I said it's meeting with Visio, you know, as you move things around, it does those fancy things to make sure that it's all tied together. And if you have, say, FileMaker, and I'll try to see if I have my recent file for untitled. So here on the graph, you can actually paste that content in. And this is just a relationship graph note, you know. So when you look at it in here, it looks like a total mess because this here is not monospace font, okay? But you can tell it to output to a monospace font, and then you get to choose the point size and the color and so on. And you can have a full working workflow or ERD or whatever you feel like drawing. You know, if you want to draw something else, then go on and draw something else. And you can actually take all of that, you know, and I'm not sure that I would necessarily use it in a script, but if you paste it in a script comment with multi-line support, so on Mac, you're going to get that in your script. So it can be very nice. I think you know, if we get to put the documentation where the developer is, that's always a winning approach, you know, because having to fetch for that same thing in a PDF format outside of the solution we're in is just that one extra step that makes it less likely that the developer is actually going to turn to it. So so yeah, and I think that's pretty much all I had for today. So I'll stop sharing so we can resume looking at each other on our webcams and discuss together for anything that you have on your mind.
Thanks, Robert. Golly, I really appreciate all that. That was really very thorough. Made me think of a lot of things. I was actually kind of chuckling because I'd been talking with some students at the University of Texas, Dallas, and their computer science thing, and they actually were big into JavaScript programming, but they were doing something called programming, golf programming, which is the exact opposite of what you're talking about, which is kind of funny because what they try to do is see if they can put all the code in one line and make it as short as possible. The goal is to make the shortest code, which is totally unreadable. And you look at these things and you're like, yeah, that might be the shortest code, but nobody could ever maintain it after you. But anyway, it's kind of funny seeing these computer science students doing that. That I'm like, okay, well, when you get to the real world, remember, I want to see a code I can look at and read.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it has some merit, like for the creativity about it, you know, like making sure that you're trying to getting the most out of the tool for a command. But in terms of practicality, I don't think it's, like you said, in the real world. Let's not roll this out. You know, we're not in any context where you know, the code has to be using quite literally Ks of memory space or things like that. That we have pretty much all the room we want. So let's make sure that we have something that's readable. Certainly.
By the way, I love Monkey Bread software. I'm sure one or two other people are cringing out there, but anyway, I love Christian. He got some awesome stuff in there.
He sure does.
So certainly fun stuff, and I really can echo a lot of your things of being able to read script steps like the find step. You know, don't do the restore. Let me enter find mode, set the field so I know what you're doing. I can read it in the code.
Yeah,
which is also really why I don't like GTRR either. So it's like, no.
Well, GTRR to some extent is just you don't choose so much what's there. I guess you implement it in a different fashion, maybe mostly by making finds, or would you elaborate on that?
Well, yeah, I would go to the other, you know, go to the other layout, enter find, and find it, and that way I can see what I'm doing. The other thing too is GTRR, when it fails to do it, doesn't fail in a way that a lot of people plan for. So that's the other thing that I see a lot of problem in code, which gets down to, you know, testing. Not only do you test your code when it works right, but test it when people do the unexpected, you know, or put what you don't expect in. So.
Yeah.
Robert, one of the things I wanted to bring up as a sort of a complementary to what you were talking about script parameters, is that on the scripts that I write, the first step in the script is always a set variable, the variable being a sample parameter, and then I put whatever the parameter is supposed to look like in there. I work that in combination with, I use a header. So the header always calls out what the parameter is supposed to be, and it says see first line, you know, that sort of thing. But you know, and if there's nothing there, I just put in false. But at least it always calls it out, and that way anybody picks it up. It's a way that anybody can go find out what's in there or what's supposed to be in there.
Yeah, that's very good. That's very good.
FYI, along the script parameters, I've gotten to where all of my stuff I pass all my script parameters using JSON. And the first step in my scripts always parses those back out into variables, and that's just what I do on all of my scripts. You know, get the script parameter and parse it, parse out all the variables automatically, and that works great.
Yeah, same thing. When I said I fell in love with JSON, it's mostly for script parameters. I'm not using that as the script parameter example because when you have named pairs, it's obvious that you have the name already to start with. So in terms of readability, it kind of solves that problem too. And some people just prefer having script parameters as being position based. It's not my preference, but for those who do, I still want to put it out there that it's about making sure each item is still named in there instead of just passing in the straight values or even a field name or something like that, because it's the context may not be quite.
Yeah. I've followed a lot of that code before. What do you think the third line is? What do you think the fourth one? So yeah, that's
yeah. And again, for plugin calls, we don't get to choose. You know, if someone has a fancy function out there that does something a bit crazy. I mean, for the stuff that is conventional FileMaker stuff, we tend to know the signature format of the function call, but for plugins, it's almost impossible to know them by heart because there's so much out there. So
yeah. Then you have monkey bread software that doesn't give you the choices. It just gives you the text form. You type in the name of the of the function.
Yes, well, that's a
it's
special.
Really more like regular programming, but anyway, it was like.
That's a yeah, it's a special case because I think in the case of Monkey Bread software, I'm almost thankful he's doing it this way, because otherwise the scroll bar in the drop down would be hard to even get in touch with. You know, I don't know if you remember. I think the first like I don't recall what Windows OS it was that, but there were cases where if a folder had so many items, the elevator of the scroll bar would shrink in size proportion to how much content there is. And if there was so much content, at some point it could get to a point where you wouldn't even you would not even be able to click on it with your mouse, you know. So I think they fixed that to say, okay, it has to have a minimum size, but yeah. So I do not know the full count of functions in MBS, but I'm thankful that they're not exposed in full in the product.
It means I have to have their web page open when I'm doing it, web page of their functions and what I'm doing. But it's all fine because I have a big monitor and it all works. Here we go. So here's you keep two big monitors going and it works. So anyway, okay. Other questions out there for Robert? Any other questions? How about, are there any FileMaker announcements coming up? I guess everybody's heard that we're FileMaker 2021's Engage, the old developers conference, is going to be virtual again too in October. I actually haven't heard a date, but anyway, it's October.
5 to 7, I believe.
Okay, 5th to 7th. Okay. It will supposedly be more interactive than just listening to a presentation, which to me was like just watching a YouTube thing or something last time. But I know they're working hard on it, and I really hope we get back to a regular conference after that. But anyway, they're plugging ahead with what they have for right now, and we'll see what happens then. That'll happen in October. So anyway, I'm thinking it would be about time that they'd start asking for proposals for presentations and stuff, but I haven't heard that unless one of you guys have. So
well, I think they said they would get the request for proposals in February, and I think that didn't happen, but my understanding is it should be any moment now.
Okay. Oh yeah, I do remember another announcement. The May 21st is the last day you can get FileMaker 18 certified, and they've already done the beta testing on the next FileMaker certification test, which is not going to be called FileMaker 19 certification. It's going to be called FileMaker certification and cover multiple versionings. So hopefully, well, supposedly that's coming out soon. So I guess we can all jump on the bandwagon to take that test whenever it comes out. So anyway. If you want to get an 18 certification, get it before May 21st. So, okay, any other announcements or anything? Or if not, I think I'm going to end the recording, and we can plan on meeting everybody back next month virtually here. This is the FileMaker Pro User Group Dallas chapter, and good having Robert here to talk about good coding. So thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.